Welcome, everyone. My name is Bob Barker, Managing Partner at Barker Gilmore, and we're pleased that you've taken some time today to join us. And for those who are maybe new to our, knowing about Barker Gilmore, we're an executive search firm. We do leadership development as well as law and compliance department consulting. Today's topic is about preparing for your performance evaluation. Particular focus is how to address in the current environment while many of us are working from home, and just the overall lack of the traditional face-to-face work environment. If we go to the next slide, Taylor, this is today's webinar is one of our series in the GC Advantage program. It's our professional development program for corporate legal and compliance leaders. We hold these sessions and webinars monthly, and the hosts are all industry experts. Many of them are senior advisors on our team or executive search consultants within our organization. But we also include members of the C-suite, CEOs, chief human resource officers, as well as board members to bring information to you and their experience. And, also many of the senior advisors on our team are also corporate board members, so they bring some unique perspectives to this information as well. So feel free to share this information that you learned today. We have a library of previous webinars, and this information from today and this recording of the webinar, as well as an executive summary, the slides, and a podcast will be added to our library in about 3 to 4 weeks. And we'll notify everyone who's registered when this information is available. And on the slide here, you can see some of the upcoming sessions, and I guess that's it for as far as this one. If you can go to the next slide, Taylor. Okay. And this is just as far as, please ask questions throughout the session today. When you use, down at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button as part of the Zoom application. You can submit your questions there. And you can also look at other questions that have been asked by others. And if your question is similar, or you just have a question that is similar, if it just, you can like that question, and what that'll do is it'll go to the top of the list, and the panelists will be able to see that more clearly, and get that questions answered either during the course of the session or at the end. And if you just go to the next slide, thanks, Taylor. And so I'm pleased to introduce our panelists today. Each of the panelists today are senior advisors at Barker Gilmore. They're all recognized as distinguished leaders, the former general counsel from some of the most respected corporations. And they're really passionate about helping leaders such as yourself achieve success in your career. So after today's webinar, feel free to contact them, discuss how they can, help you achieve your goals, your dreams, your aspirations. And then I guess without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Helen. And so Helen, if you just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Bob. Let me start before I do that and thank our distinguished advisors for joining us today, as well as everybody who's listening in. We are gratified to have on this panel very, very accomplished former general counsel who are current advisors and coaches to Barker Gilmore. We start, Anne, by you giving a short background.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Helen. And it's great to be here, and it's especially good to be with Helen and Marla. I always learn so much from listening to both of you. My background is actually largely what you see on the slide. I started my career as an M&A and finance lawyer in private practice in the Midwest, and then had the privilege of joining the legal team at the J.M. Smucker Company, where I was the general counsel. And since my retirement, have done a fair amount of actually corporate board work, has become an encore career for me, as well as coaching and executive leadership development, primarily with general counsel and assistant general counsel in that corporate space. So thanks again for allowing me to be part of the conversation. And Marla, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks, Helen, and welcome, everybody. I spent almost 30 years in-house in the pharmaceutical industry, first at Baxter International and then later at Boehringer Ingelheim. 12 of my 30 years were spent as GC, both at Baxter and at Boehringer. While I was a GC, I worked for 5 different CEOs, and before becoming a GC myself, I worked for 3 different general counsel. So I spent a lot of time adapting how I did my performance reviews to what the expectations of my bosses were. Since retiring from the practice of law, I spend my time, like Anne does, on board service, both for-profit and nonprofit, and also on executive coaching for general counsel. Helen, how about you? Tell everyone about you.
Thank you, Marla. As you could see, I was formerly Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the PNC Financial Services Group. PNC is a publicly traded company, and it's one of the largest diversified financial services companies in the United States. I led a department of over 100 lawyers and served on the company's executive committee. I was the general counsel of the holding company for over 18 years, and before that, I was the general counsel of one of PNC's subsidiary banks, which had a much smaller legal department. Before going in-house, I was a partner at the law firm Ballard Spahr. In addition, for several years, I taught a course at Penn Law School on the challenges facing general counsel. I also reported to several CEOs, 3 specifically, and also seen very different styles in how the CEOs like their interactions with the general counsel. I now spend my time, like Marla and Anne, as an advisor and coach and serve on several boards. So our program today focuses on preparing for and conducting your performance review during the pandemic. As we all know, the business and personal stresses this year are absolutely enormous, and the upheaval has been compounded by the challenges of remote working, which for many include assisting children at home with online education, doing more work with fewer resources, and no boundaries between home and work life. The performance review process and what you want to accomplish in the process this year are likely to be very different from previous years, but there are also several similarities. Before we start our program, Taylor, please post our preliminary polling questions. Okay, while you're all filling those out, we will turn to the program. Marla, let's start with you. What are the likely challenges in the performance review process this year?
I'm going to call it the 3 Ds: distance, distraction, and disinclination. I mean, COVID has been an excuse as well as a complicating factor for throwing typical performance reviews and activities out the window. But I think that you need to take ownership of the fact that the monkey is on your back to make sure that the CEO has had visibility as to what you've been doing above and beyond helping your companies survive and hopefully thrive in the age of COVID. Because everybody is doing things not just COVID related. However, it casts such a big shadow that certainly people in the C-suite and the CEO and the board may not actually keep an eye on all the other things that you've been doing throughout the course of the year. Obviously, the challenges include the financial challenges that are facing companies and people taking the attitude, well, what does performance reviews really matter anyway, since there's so many salary freezes and downsizing and bonuses being canceled. But I think that these are dangerous mindsets to have, because we will get past COVID. There will be a new normal, and you can still thrive and grow during the days of COVID.
Thank you. Ann, do you have anything to add before we get into some more specifics?
Yeah, thank you, Helen. You know, at a high macro level, feedback right now really has to be both flexible and disciplined. Those may seem like sort of counterbalance concepts, but just the nimbleness as well as the discipline in how we communicate, what we communicate, when we communicate, to whom we communicate is really critical. And I know that we're going to unpack that as we go throughout the conversation, but just to keep that in mind, both flexibility and discipline and how you can marry those two. Because at the end of the day, just like Marla said, it is not business as usual. You know, some companies, depending on the culture, take the approach, it's business as usual, we're going to just stay in there, put our head down and get it done. But the reality is that even though we need to get the work done, the way we go about it is just not business as usual. And that bleeds over into performance reviews.
Thanks, Ann. Marla, how would you prepare for a performance review this year?
Well, I would not do anything differently this year than what I would do in the past. So same as every year, my practice always had been to keep a running list of my accomplishments, because what I did in February, it would be a distant, if any, memory come November, when I had to fill out whatever forms the company wanted for evaluation. So I always kept a running list of what I accomplished, and I compared and contrast that to the goals that I had signed up for or were assigned to me. So I would suggest that it's still very important to be doing that, because we will get distracted by the loudest barking dog, which just happens to be COVID right now. That doesn't mean that you didn't do things in the 2 months before COVID hit and the business as usual work that you've been doing since COVID hit. And I think it's also very important that you put together an advocacy piece that focuses on your ability and your successes in adapting to a virtual or alternative environment if you're not working virtually yourselves. The important thing is to remember that you were assigned business goals and operational goals at the beginning of the year before we knew there was a COVID. And I think that companies will still be holding employees responsible for meeting those goals. Obviously, the financial goals will have shifted and slipped. So for your budget for outside counsel spending may be different than what in actuality happened because of COVID, but there's still goals. And in your performance review, you need to be prepared to address what you've accomplished in your goals, but also highlight how you've helped the company adapt and your department adapt to these unprecedented times.
Thanks, Marla. Ann, I know you and Marla believe it's important to make your performance review part of a continuing process and not just a one-year event during a formal performance review. Could you talk about that a little more, Ann, and talk about why you think it's especially important to do this year during the pandemic?
Sure, absolutely. Great question, Helen. And really, you're right. I think both Marla and I in the past, when we've had this conversation, have reinforced the importance of making performance review part of an ongoing process, an ongoing conversation, no surprises at the end of the year. And it is especially important this year. In fact, it is more important now, in my opinion, than it has been ever in the past. And it's more important on the giving end, and it's the more important on the receiving end. So let's talk a little bit about, from a GC perspective or assistant GC perspective, how you prepare for the feedback you're going to be receiving from the CEO or whomever you report to. And just to build a little bit upon what Marla said about focusing on where you started the years, because we did have several months for calendar year companies before COVID. So what were the goals? What had you managed to accomplish? Where are we now against those initial goals? But even more so, the creativity about how you've shifted, how you've changed the way you work, your department work, and still met those goals, I think will be critical. And that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is about what are the new goals that have come out of the pandemic. You know, the new goals may be something seemingly as simple as keeping the team together and keeping them focused. And that is, in some situations, in some industries, an incredibly difficult task. And so I think that chapter 2 is really defining for your CEO how you've had to shift your goals and how you've succeeded in shifting both the goals and priorities and accomplished those. So it's difficult to have that conversation in a static format. So hence, again, the importance of continually making that conversation part of an ongoing performance review. So it is those regular check-ins in however works best for your CEO or general counsel that are critical in how you really share that piece of your goals and accomplishments throughout the year.
Thank you. And picking up on what you said, you know, it really, frequent check-ins provide a really critical opportunity for real-time feedback and mid-course adjustments, not only in terms of the goal, but if you are not in the CEO or general counsel's mind, adapting or providing value that he or she needs at the time, you could elicit that information and make adjustments rather than waiting till the end of the year. So very important to have frequent check-ins. Marla, I think you were about to add something too.
Right, I was just going to add that generally I always found that the good rule of thumb was what I expected from the people who reported to me as far as check-ins and updates is the same standard that I would hold myself to for reporting to the CEO, or before I was a general counsel, to the general counsel. So it's, you know, you kind of give as good as you get.
Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. And just to use that performance review to get your message out. This is about how you craft your story on an ongoing basis.
why, and it's somewhat obvious, but maybe not, are frequent check-ins especially important if you're working remotely, or the CEO or general counsel are working remotely?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it really is about both crafting the story and reaching out to provide updates in those areas where you may need support and help. I mean, regardless of whether you're working entirely remotely as a leadership team or it's some hybrid model, communication channels have been really stressed. The amount of information that needs to be exchanged by email, Microsoft Teams, phone calls, now more than ever. You know, walking down the hall is just not a reality for 99% of us right now. And so those communications have changed. You know, everybody has that Zoom fatigue, that conference call fatigue. So thinking about what your message is, how the person with whom you're communicating likes to receive that message, and making it as succinct as possible and yet robust as possible is really critical. So it goes back to that flexibility and discipline. Flexibility in how you communicate, and discipline to make sure you do it regularly so that there are no surprises and so that you can all, get the feedback you need and reach your goals.
And Anne, I think you hit on a really important part. So it's not only what you communicate, but how you communicate your updates and your check-ins with your CEO or your general counsel. And it's all about understanding the preferred communication channel, so you tailor your communication to your audience. I think particularly when we're going to be focusing on performance review, it's important to have had in your pocket formal scheduled meetings, whether it's once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month. That shouldn't change during the days of COVID. And it includes setting your agenda ahead of time to help your audience, in this case, your general counsel or your CEO, depending on who you report to, put their mind in the right mindset, because people are moving from Zoom conference to telephone call to just trying to figure out how to stay connected. So you want to set up your listener, in this case your CEO or your GC, to have the right mindset and to help them focus. And it's also, I think, important to use a variety of communication methods. So for an actual performance review, I would want to have that by way of Zoom or team meetings or whatever video conferencing capabilities your organization has, because I want to see the person who's giving me the review. Because from communication, only a small percentage of communication effectiveness are the actual words you use. So much of it is based on body language, and I'd want to be able to see the body language. Same thing in giving a performance review. I'd want to be able to look at the person I was giving the review to. So number one, I could see how they are adapting to the information, how they're taking it in, but they can also see the context of my message far and above just what the words are. But again, it really depends for general updates and check-ins. What's the preferred form of communication by the recipient?
Video conferencing also has the advantage of minimizing people multitasking and not fully engaging. So you get both for performance reviews and substantive updates, if your recipient, CEO, or general counsel could tolerate it. For important, sensitive, or performance reviews, it is a more effective communication vehicle. Taylor, would you post the responses to the first polling questions so we have a sense of? So
interesting. The vast majority of people are working from home every day.
Right.
So it is a virtual world.
Right. Including the CEO and the general counsel. A few more tactical comments about how do you check in with the CEO, the general counsel, whomever you're reporting to. I think I say this from a lot of personal experience in the Zoom world, to make sure you have enough internet speed to support Zoom or other video platforms. It's very, very frustrating. I think, as we all know, if Zoom crashes or keeps freezing, that may be the end of your continuing communications on Zoom or video if the recipient gets very frustrated, including you. Knowing, to pick up on what Marla and Ann said about knowing your audience, it's important to know when to schedule telephonic or video calls, especially when you're working remotely. Have a sense, if you can, of whether the CEO has, or whoever you're reporting to, has family responsibilities or other times that aren't desirable for a performance review call or performance review check-in or a sensitive or highly substantive call. And understand the company's calendar. So if it's earnings call time for a public company or it's board meeting time, have an understanding of whether that's a stressful time for the recipient of important information, and try not to schedule that. And on your own end, try to schedule it if possible for uninterrupted or quiet times at your end. The other thing I'll add, during a particularly stressful period, I've shared this with Marla and Ann and Bob in the past. In pre-COVID times, I proposed to the first CEO I reported to that we catch up by jogging together once a week. And it turned out to be a very productive way to catch up, brainstorm, and develop a very strong relationship. Obviously, during these times when we have to social distance, it's not viable, but you could substitute that depending on your relationship with the CEO, general counsel, whomever you report to have a walk or coffee outside, weather permitting. So again, it's just another example of thinking more creatively on how do you have check-ins and get the person you're reporting to full attention where possible. Let me add one thing. I also think it's important on the subject of periodic check-ins to check in with other senior business and functional leaders to make sure you're addressing their needs and concerns and identifying risk and getting alignments if needed. I think, as we all know, the CEO's or general counsel views are informed by what others think about your performance. Also, it's an important way to identify and manage risk. Anything to add on the tactical check-ins, Marla or Ann?
Just perhaps the obvious, but in times of great stress, it's human nature to ignore the obvious, and that is ask your CEO or general counsel what they want, when they want it, how they want it. Just asking the question, what is best for them? It is really important just to take that moment and ask that question. And then, Helen, what you said about sort of your peer group of other C-suite executives, the business leads, the CFO, all critical really to do a similar check-in with, even if it's not performance review related, business check-in related, to find out, just to catch up and make sure that sort of offline, you know how they're doing, I think is really important and does come back to benefit you through that performance review, because to your point, the CEO does get feedback from others about how well the general counsel or assistant general counsel is doing.
Thanks, Ann. Taylor, could you post the next polling question? Thank you. Ann, how do you think COVID impacts how you should conduct your formal performance review this year, assuming you have one? And also, how should you focus the discussion, and what should you try to accomplish?
Well, we've talked around the edges of some of that already, Helen, but I think you should start with, where did you start the year? You had your goals at the beginning of the year. How have you measured up against those goals? And for many companies, those goals got disrupted midstream. And so to call it out, this is where we were in progress, as of March, whatever it was. Here's how we pivoted. Here's where we are now. Here's how the company refocused goals. And here's how our department was nimble enough and flexible enough to shift to meet those goals. So it's both about where we started, where we changed midstream, how we've done in response to those changes. And then also from my perspective, I think there's an opportunity to really get a focused message across about what is going well during this new period that we're in, and what do we need to change? How are we adjusting how we do business, both as a legal department and a company? How how is it beneficial? How do we need to make some further modification? And then at the appropriate point, sort of what of these changes should we consider keeping going forward? So I think all of that is part of a performance review and a conversation about where the business is and where the department is at this current point in time. So I think this is an opportunity to review conversation much broader, and it's an opportunity that doesn't always present itself, and that you should take advantage of it.
And I think that's a great point, because it also, as you're describing it, you are you are projecting yourself as a leader, not somebody who's just thinking narrowly about how did I do this year? You know, what changes should be made? What did we learn out of this? What did we learn as a company out of this? I think those are very important points in generally in your communications with your CEO, general counsel, or whomever you report to. Just thinking as a leader.
And we have a unique moment in time to really take that perspective and to have it help the business and help our objectives as well.
And just to pile on there, one of the pieces of feedback that general counsel often get, or if you poll CEOs, you hear CEOs say they wish their general counsel were more strategic. In this particular year, this particular time, this, I think, is a very unique opportunity to focus throughout the course of the year, but specifically during performance review time, on how you think strategically, taking the lessons learned from COVID, and how should the company apply it going forward, and how are you as leader of the legal department or the compliance department going to shift what business as usual is going to mean on a going forward basis, and help morph the conversation into what should our goals next year be? Beyond financial goals, but the operational goals and the personnel goals.
Great points. Great points.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on something that Ann said when we were talking about tactics of check-ins, asking the CEO what he or general counsel what he or she would like. Related to what we've been talking about is being comfortable in asking your CEO or general counsel, what would you like me to focus on for the rest of this year, next year? What would you like to be my highest priorities? This is what I think, but solicit his or her views. How could I add the most value to you and the company now and going forward? So those are, again, you want to get as much feedback as you can in addition to relaying your thoughts.
Absolutely. And if it's, Helen, if I might, I'd like to pivot just for a second and make an observation about performance reviews and those conversations from the perspective of the person giving that performance review. So for general counsels or compliance officers, I think it's a real opportunity and a mandate for a successful conversation that we recognize the new urgency of coming into that discussion with an emotional intelligence and truly an empathy for where your team member stands right now. So if they do have heightened home responsibilities, regardless of what the situation is, everyone is facing a new and different kind of stress. And to just pause, ask them how they're managing through that, and let that naturally flow into a conversation about the business. Because as you started off, Helen, the lines are blurred right now. They may be blurred forever, but certainly right now, the lines between home and work are blurred. So to acknowledge that and to call it out, I think is really helpful both for the relationship and for the conversation, regardless of whether you have to convey some difficult news about performance or it's all very positive. sort of understanding where that person begins and what their situation is critical for an effective communication. And I think it will make for a better and more productive result as well.
Great, thank you. Marla, actually, I want to pick up on something you said. When you talked about in the course of the year, preparing a list of your accomplishments and how those relate to the goals. Let's focus now, we're at the end of the year for most people. And what's your view, and I'll ask you both your view on whether you this year have a verbal writing of your past accomplishments and whether you met the goals and how the goals have changed, or do that orally in a performance review. What's your end report look like, verbal, oral, and what's included?
Well, first and foremost, I would follow whatever human resources has as the usual framework. I mean, most large companies, and I've only worked at large companies, but most large companies have formal review processes. Now they are largely online, where you fill out something and then it goes to your supervisor, and your supervisor fills it out, and then it goes back to you. I would follow those precepts. If it's in place, I would be using it. If there's nothing in writing that the company typically does for purposes of performance review, as putting on my lawyer hat for just a second, that's not a particularly good thing, because then the company has no history or background, particularly if somebody is failing as an employee. There's nothing in writing, there's no feedback trail. So I would lead by example and put together in writing, this is what my goals were, this is how I accomplished my goals. And in any event, I would put something in writing, because for no other reason that I want my boss to have the chance to sit down, read it ahead of time, even if it's only 5 minutes ahead of time, so that when I come to the meeting, my CEO is of a mindset to listen and talk about me, as opposed to talking about other things, which often can happen as conversations get derailed. And that's even true for purposes of seeking feedback, as opposed to just saying, is there anything I could do better? Which I don't think is a particularly helpful question to really focus a discussion. It's to break down the request for feedback as well as the giving of feedback to people who report to you into component parts. And which parts you use are pretty much up to you. So when I would be seeking feedback from my CEO, I would ask, is there anything I can do in the way I'm communicating with you that will make it easier for you to stay on top of what I'm doing and take actions that I need you to take to support me? Or is there anything that you've observed with regard to the operations or my leadership of the legal department that you suggest would be a good goal for the upcoming year to change? Or you see me as a member of your senior leadership team, how do you view my contributions, and is there anything you think I should be doing differently, including the interactions with the board? Break it down into component parts, and then that gives your CEO the opportunity to give you more helpful feedback, and gives you, in giving your feedback to your team members, the opportunity to give them actionable feedback, because that's what we really want, is actionable feedback. If my CEO says to me, oh, Marla, no, you're doing a great job, just keep doing what you're doing, I mean, that's nice, I feel nice and warm and fuzzy, but I don't take away anything actionable. I would much rather hear, Oh, yeah, you're doing great, Marla. You know, in particular, I really like when you do A, B, and C, or I like how you handled X situation. Then it's something tangible that I can do more of, or less of, or change over time.
Those are great questions, Marla. One question that was asked that maybe we could incorporate uh, some responses to. Somebody has asked, and thank you for this question, uh, she reports to the board. Are there any suggestions that for reporting to the board, or are the comments you're giving about reporting to the CEO or the general counsel, would the reporting to the board be any different? The same kind of conversation, same kind of continual communication about your accomplishments, anything different?
This is Anne. I think that can be a little trickier. I mean, at a very high level, there probably should not be much of a difference, but the reality is if you report to the board chair or the audit committee chair directly, the communication flow is probably not as regular as a reporting relationship with the CEO. There's certainly exceptions to every rule, but as a routine matter, probably not as often. And so to look for opportunities to just check in by phone or Zoom to schedule those meetings, if historically they'd not been scheduled, I think is very helpful. And I'm particularly struck by the comments that Marla just made. I thought those were excellent questions that could be used with the board chair or audit committee chair, that just really getting the specific feedback. But overall, sort of taking the approach of here were the objectives at the beginning of the year, here's where we are, here's how we've pivoted to react to situations since COVID. But you may have to think a little more strategically about how best to have that communication. And then even though, lastly, even though you may report directly to board chair, audit committee chair, or whomever it is, at most companies, there is benefit to circling back with the CEO and just at a high level saying, I just had my performance review or a conversation with so-and-so, you know, it went well, and maybe give them a few sort of high level observations about the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great
CEO
point.
No CEO likes to be surprised. Yeah.
Exactly right. No surprises in your communications with the board for the CEO, unless the board has asked you not to talk to the CEO about it, or it's a particularly sensitive situation with respect to the CEO's own performance.
Yeah,
That could
the
be
one thing I would
unintended
add,
consequence.
the one thing I'd add to that is that the recognition that board members are one step further away from what you as a general counsel do day in and day out than is the CEO. And so what they understand or what they're interested in may be a little bit different. And so that will require more context to be placed around your report out on what you've accomplished, because they're not living it day in and day out the same way that the people who are actually running the company are doing. And number two, to understand what's truly strategic and what's truly of value and interest to whoever on the board you are reporting to. So typically, you know, what boards, you know, care about are strategy and succession planning and risk. And that's pretty much the way I would focus my, the information I would provide to the board in preparation for them giving me feedback.
Thanks. Taylor, can you post the response to the last question, polling question? So the majority of companies are still doing performance reviews, but it's in a remote vehicle. Okay, that's helpful. One of the questions that was asked is the performance review, performance review, a good time or poor time to ask for a new opportunity? And I'll add to that a little. Is it a good time or not to ask for increased responsibilities, different responsibilities, to move to a different function? And let me modify that a little, particularly in the year of the pandemic, when there's a lot of stress and challenge in the organization. Could we start with you, Anne? What do you think?
Often being mindful, certainly being mindful of that stress within the organization will be critical. But I think it's a good time. It's all in about how you communicate it. Knowing who your audience is, knowing how it will be received, those are really important questions to ask yourself before the conversation. But as you're going through that discussion, you're talking about your objectives for the year, your successes for the year, the places where there's still opportunities to complete some of those objectives. Hopefully, there's also a time for a conversation around your personal professional development goals. So where do you see yourself in 2 years, in 4 years? Where does your CEO see you in 2 years and 4 years? And there is often an opportunity to say, you know, I look forward to continuing my role with the company. I look forward to my professional development. I would be very interested in an opportunity in X department or with increased responsibilities, you know, in this area. You know, what is your sense of that? What do I need to do in order, if you don't feel that I'm quite ready for it yet, what do I need to do to become ready? Because this is really where my long-term interests lie. I'd like to stay with the company. You know how to craft that for your audience and for your particular objectives. But generally, I think it's a great time to have that conversation.
And I try to avoid any surprises during a performance review, either giving or getting. And so if there are desires that I have at the company to expand my responsibility or perhaps change responsibilities, this should be part of the ongoing discussion, I think, that you're having with your CEO or your general counsel, depending upon who you are reporting to. But I agree that this point in time may be a unique opportunity to bring up at your performance review, taking on a new role, depending upon what the role is and what's going on at your company. Nature abhors a vacuum, and there's nothing like a good crisis to show where are the weak points or the blank spaces in the way the company is operating. And if you see that there are weak points or blank spaces and it's something that you would like to take on as responsibility, I think this is a very opportune time to talk about that and observe what the company has experienced and how you can step in on a going forward basis to help with that. But you can't be tone deaf. You have to be listening to what the feedback is that your CEO is giving you. So if the CEO is giving you feedback like, you know, you have a lot of balls in the air here, Marla, and, you know, I constantly worry about you dropping X. That wouldn't be a good time for me to say, I hear what you're saying, George, but, you know, I really would like to take on more responsibility. You have to listen to what the feedback is to see whether this is the appropriate time to ask for something more or different.
Absolutely. And picking up on that, if you're reporting to the general counsel and you want to leave the legal department, this may not be the opportune time to ask to leave if things are so stressful and the workload is so heavy and resources are thin. But you could sow the seeds for the future and say, this is something that I'm interested in longer term. And, you know, to pick up on what Anne and Marla said, I would any suggestions you have now or in the future about how I help position myself and how you could help me make that transition at the appropriate time. But again, understand the environment.
Yeah, know your audience.
Marla, how do you think you should bring up compensation during your performance review?
Again, goes to my don't like to have surprises sprung on anybody at the performance review time. Typically, performance review and budget creation for the ensuing year do not happen at the same time. I think the most opportune time to talk about compensation expectations is during the budgeting time. So after the budget is already approved for next year, may be too late if you're looking for some sort of a substantial type of increase. So if you're a general counsel, your salary and bonus and overhead comes out of either your budget or your CEO's budget. And so that's why I think talking about expectations about salary, like I've taken a look at the Barker Gilmore compensation report for general counsel, and I see that I'm in the bottom quartile. However, the company's goal is to have people at the 50th percentile. How are we going to get me to the 50th percentile? Once the budget's locked and loaded, it's a little late for that type of discussion. What would make sense and what's something that I would do after I raised expectations or even just the point during budgeting time was during my performance review, I'd say something like, so in light of your evaluation of my performance and my contributions, what are your plans with regard to my compensation for the upcoming year? So I would know and would give us a chance to talk about it. But again, repeating myself, can't be tone deaf. What's going on at the company? What's the company's financial situation? If there have been salary reductions or holdbacks, or bonus deferrals or cancellations, significant headcount reductions, this is probably not the best time to be asking for a 10 to 15% raise. Everything has to be in the right context.
Absolutely. Ann, do you have anything to add?
Just that, again, to not be tone deaf. I really like Marla's approach to beginning and opening the conversation. So you don't have to ignore dollars. No one ignores dollars. You can have the conversation about it, but it's not the point in time to necessarily ask for that raise, but rather to say exactly what Marla suggested. Given our conversation about performance and expanded roles and what are the plans for approaching compensation, or even, here's where I'd like to get to. What can I do over time to make sure that I'm meeting your expectations so that we can arrive at, this place, whatever that percentage is. But this is, right now is a tricky time to be asking for bonus increases, to be asking for raises. It's really, that's a tricky one.
I absolutely agree. In different times, however, or if your company is an aberrant in this environment and is giving out bonuses or equity, and you have not been a recipient, and nonetheless in your performance review you've gotten very good feedback, there's really nothing wrong, in my view, to express your disappointment in your compensation.
Right. I mean, if I was general counsel of Amazon right now, I'd be asking for a big, healthy raise. There are some businesses, some companies that have seen tremendous uptick in their business because of COVID. Again, it's what is the atmosphere and how do you fit into that atmosphere and take advantage of it or take heed from it?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And Helen, Yeah, and Helen, to your point of if your colleagues have received bonuses or substantial increase and you've just gotten a solid performance review, you know, that is, to me, a totally appropriate time to say, help me understand this. You know, to me, there's a disconnect here. Help me understand why we've just had this conversation and yet.
Exactly right. Marla, are there potential pitfalls to avoid in your performance review? You know, we've talked about some of them, obviously, really understanding the environment and not stepping into something at an inappropriate time. But anything else to be careful of during this period of time of COVID or any other time?
I'm not sure that I see anything different now than during the days before COVID and hopefully after COVID. Obviously, at a performance review is not the time to take out your debating skills and debate the feedback. You have to suck it up and listen to the feedback. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to listen to it because perception is reality. And if you feel yourself getting angry or emotional, listen to the feedback and ask some clarifying questions, and then say, you know, you've given me a lot to think about. I'm going to go back and think about it. And then I'd like us to talk about this again, sort of like a cooling off period, because you don't want to respond emotionally. And that's true in giving and getting feedback. It's important that emotions do not play a role in it. And disagreement is not argument. Disagreement is the opportunity to ask clarifying questions and share that, you know, I have a little different point of view on what happened in that situation. So you're giving information, but there's nothing to think about it. Those of you who have people reporting to you, when you give somebody feedback and they fight you on the feedback, you really want to strangle them. And there's no reason to expect that your CEO doesn't feel exactly the same way if you respond in kind to their feedback.
You guys are good suggestions. Anne, anything to add?
It's just, it really is all about creating expectations, setting the tone. I think more important now than ever to listen and to take that pause. And as Marla so aptly put it, to turn disagreement into discussion. If you can reframe in your mind that it's not a disagreement, it's a discussion, and to really listen for, frankly, what may be, you know, even if you don't agree with the feedback, there's going to be some element of truth because it's that person's truth. You know, what they're telling you, what they're sharing with you is how they perceive you, right or wrong. So I think it's really more important than ever to just listen and to take it in.
Absolutely. The areas of caution I have suggested in addition to those is to be careful not to take credit for what the CEO has done or the general counsel has done. So if it's been the CEO's initiative in listing your accomplishments, don't say it was your initiative. I think it's happened to us all on the receiving end. I think it's important also not to blame others for gaps in your performance or goals that you didn't meet. There, may be exceptions to everything, but as a general rule, also related not to exaggerate your accomplishments, but on the other hand, don't be shy about stating your accomplishments. And if you're doing your self-evaluation in writing, your self-evaluation is discoverable in legal proceedings and with everything else you do in a company. Be careful what you write. So we have one additional question that's been asked so far, and that was the GC considered for a CEO or COO role in your companies in your experience in coaching others? Marla, would you have any experience with that, or Anne?
I don't have any personal experience with that, but when I first started working with Baxter, the CEO and chairman of the board had originally been the general counsel of Baxter. And this was, years before I joined the company, but he was elevated to the CEO space. And we see that's happening more and more these days, where general counsel are more fleet of foot and they can move into business roles because more is expected of general counsel than in the past. Giving good legal advice is sort of like the opening ante. Being a smart, wise, and strategic business person is what's needed and expected. So I would think that in future we'll see more and more of this. But personally, nobody ever asked me to become CEO of a company or move into the COO role. But honestly, I never asked for it either. I was given business opportunities, running various subsidiaries and divisions, but I never asked to become COO of the company or CEO of the company. So it's a two-way street. If you want it, you have to ask for it.
Ann?
Yeah, I think it is becoming much more common these days. The other thing that we're seeing on a pretty regular basis is when there is an unexpected vacancy, either in an operating role or in the CEO role, that the general counsel will step in on an interim basis. And that can be an excellent opportunity to really prove that both you think strategically and you can take an operational role that, and succeed in that operational role. So I'm seeing that even more is on an interim basis. And then sometimes what is an interim becomes permanent, but even if it doesn't, you've established your ability to really function well in that role. And so long as you have a business perspective and are known for that business acumen in addition to your legal role, I think that it's possible and no reason not to have that transition into an operational role.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen it in the last few years in pharmaceutical companies, where where there is bet the company litigation, and the board has seen the general counsel in the role of giving strategic advice about what to do. The advice in very complicated situations, the advice turns out to be right at the end, and the general counsel has taken a leadership role in communicating risk and managing enterprise risk in the company with respect to the company litigation and other high-risk matters. So if you have a very close relationship with the board, and to pick up on what Marla and Ann have said, the board has seen you both as a broad business counselor and thinker, and particularly if they've seen you in a role that is of stress in the company and how you've handled it, you probably have the opportunity depending on the situation. So,
but as in all things, that which gets you there doesn't keep you there. And so many times I've seen general counsel move into a CEO role in part because of the really bet the company type of issues that the general counsel helped the company overcome. But once those issues are over and they're in the CEO slot, then it all becomes company growth, P&L, strategic acquisitions. And so just keep in mind that which gets you here doesn't allow you to stay there. And so it's going to be a growth role over time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we have come to the end of our formal program, and Ann and Marla, thank you so much, but we will stay on if there are any remaining questions. I think we've asked those that are outstanding, but We invite you to ask any additional questions if you have them. And even after our program, if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact Ann, Marla, or me.
And Taylor, if you can just go to the next slide so that their contact information is available. Again, Helen, Marla, and Ann, thank you so much for participating today and sharing your insights. Again, for those who are joining us today, don't be shy. If you think there's opportunities where any of us can be of assistance, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll do our best to provide assistance or point you in the right direction. And then lastly is we are going to be sending just a kind of a 1-minute survey. So if you would just take a minute to share your thoughts on today's webinar and what you liked and areas we can improve, that information is extremely valuable. Otherwise, again, thanks for joining, and we look forward to having you join us on future GC Advantage programs.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.